Anyway, my name is Anupreeta Das, and I am a South Asia correspondent for the New York Times. I moved back here in July, and I've moved back from reporting to editing to reporting. So my career has mostly been in financial journalism, and I spent the past 5 years at the New York Times, and before that at the Wall Street Journal, and before that at Reuters. But I did get my start at the Indian Express. And so that entire span has been in financial journalism, but it's still given me a really good perspective into how newsrooms work across the board. But what I did want to talk a little bit about, which I think is really important when you think about the future of newsrooms and the future of the news business, in fact, is the role and the interplay of media and technology. And by technology, I actually mean two companies, Google and Microsoft, and how they've almost single-handedly been able to upend the news business, the way newsrooms work, the way publishers work and think about their own future. And so let me start, and I'm going to be speaking mostly about the U.S. media because that's where my experience is. But I think some of that will be relevant to Indian newsrooms as well, and newsrooms everywhere. So let me go back to sort of 30, 35 years ago, in the 80s and 90s, which was the heyday of publishing of newspapers. And this was a time when you had newspapers flush with cash. They, had very, very good deals for foreign correspondents like me. And, there was a lot of ambition in what news organizations were doing. And there were two main ways in which newspapers were funded back in the day, right? One was advertising. Subscriptions, of course, was important, but advertising was, I would say, the majority of how newspapers got funded. And that was the classified ads, and that was the display ads that you see, even in the print product. And then came Google back in the 90s, late 90s, but I would say in the 2000s and 2007, especially with an acquisition that the company did that I'll come to. But what Google did as a search engine was move a lot of news online, right? So in the beginning, it was great for newspapers because they found that they could reach bigger audiences further away. So they were happy to give that news away for free. And they didn't really think about the implications it would have on the business. But in 2007, Google acquired this company called DoubleClick, and that really changed the way advertising worked for newsrooms. What happened was that suddenly you were able to put search results and advertising together, right? So if you're looking for a pair of shoes and you go on Google and you say, hey, I want a pair of sports shoes, and then you have advertising technology that allows you to target that, right? We all know about targeted advertising. But what that meant for newspapers was that suddenly you lost your biggest source of revenue. So what that did, that was the business, right? What that did inside the newsroom was hugely significant. It changed the way people did news. It changed the number of, newsrooms that weren't well managed just got felled. You had hundreds of bankruptcies or newsrooms, publishers getting, bought over by private equity firms and things like that. And some of them combined, some of them had to downsize, cut hundreds and hundreds of jobs. But it also meant that newsrooms became more efficient about how to use technology and how to think about that, right? So you were leaner, you were, more adaptive, you relied less on someone going out there for basic news. And so that was, this is all like a prelude to the bigger point that I'm coming to, which is that existential threat that was posed to newspapers by the tech industry, namely Google, is you're seeing a version of that existential threat play out through AI, and in particular, Microsoft and OpenAI with ChatGPT 4. And this has become one of the things that is driving the New York Times in how it thinks about its own future. At the same time as, we are writing as reporters, we are writing about AI and the importance of it, just covering it. We're also changing the way we think about journalism, especially entry level tasks like, transcription, all of that could help reporters do their jobs better. So you could do transcription fact checking through AI. But the biggest threat to the future is in the sense that, and this comes largely from a lawsuit filed last year by the New York Times, and this is, I think, a standard bearer for the entire industry. And the lawsuit basically alleged that ChatGPT-4 was being trained by millions of articles that were published in the New York Times, right? So basically that to build your large language models, you had to find information from somewhere. News was a big part of it. And the New York Times, because it's, the most, I'll say that since I'm an employee, the most trustworthy organization in the world, in the US, definitely, I think those articles had a lot of value, right? So the Times last year sued Microsoft and OpenAI for copyright infringement, right? So what that meant was that you're saying that, hey, OpenAI, you're going in, basically stealing all my information, and you're building a business off of stuff that me and my reporters, right, all of the talent, all of the effort, all of that goes into producing journalism, you are now taking advantage of that and building your own models. And this is a real threat to how newsrooms work, because the argument is that if you're summarizing our news, right, if you're summarizing what we have produced, and you're, say, if I'm going and searching for something happens, say, there's a war in Syria and I want to know what happened, I could just go and get a summary based of the reporting of news publications, right? The Journal, the Times, whoever else. And that then reduces the subscriber base. This is the argument, eventually, of newspapers. And that then takes away from the money you would need to do the work of investigative journalism, which is a core aspect of news and absolutely essential for democracy, right? So the idea that you can hold, power to account, the idea that you might need years to do that, and just think of the Me Too, sexual assault, the whole story, right? That took years to come together, and the two reporters, Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey, they were freed to do nothing but pursue like a tip, right? So you're paying, and this is just like a very small example, but you're paying to support the work of two reporters who may never have gotten that story, right? But you freed them up, and that allows for societal change, right? So they're reporting on the sexual harassment and assault cases against Harvey Weinstein, the movie producer, led to just how we think about gender and sexual assault in the workplace, right? So to do that kind of journalism, it's very important to continue to have subscriptions, to continue to have paywalls, which the Times is saying that ChatGPT's scraping of data to build its LLMs, large language models, is really hurting. So I think that is one of the more important arguments that is a threat, an existential threat to the future of news and journalism. And the other is that we're increasingly in this polarized world where it's full of misinformation, disinformation, it's kind of bring your own facts, right? Like there isn't an established, there isn't something that's established. We can't even agree on the facts, right? So in an environment like that, having one organization, having a respected organization or an industry that is based on reporting and verifying and establishing facts and presenting them is hugely important as as a way to keep things on track, as a way to kind of provide a center and a balance to how people think, how people react, how people operate in society. And if you give it all over to kind of AI, what happens is that then you're again creating maybe untruths. You're creating what they call hallucinations, right? You're creating the potential for even more untruths, casual, misinformation, um, intentional misinformation, disinformation. And that, again, is actually really harmful for a democratic society. So these two arguments were made by the Times last year in this groundbreaking case. And, we just don't know what the outcome will be. But I think the entire industry, news industry, came together on this. Where does this go? I mean, a lot of it depends on a judge, right? Microsoft, I think earlier this year, made the case that using, and this is a US law, right, that it's called fair use. And so what they're saying is that, look, are taking some information and data from the New York Times content library, essentially, sorry for the jargon, is within fair use because it's for greater good, i.e. to train AI to be smarter, to be more helpful. And so I don't know if the judge buys that argument, but ultimately I do think that you'll have to come to some sort of negotiated settlement, which might look like, hey, company X, if you're going to use our information, we want to be paid for it. Or there might be some regulatory frameworks. These are all just kind of out there and up there, and like it's just like the chips are up there. We just don't know where they're going to fall. But I think the point remains that it is really essential to pay for news, and it is and newspapers aren't going to make the mistake they did last time around, which is when they just gave their news away for free and then like kind of lost a lot of that advertising support that led to kind of the shrinking of the industry. So I think people in the news business are trying to get in front of that with this landmark lawsuit that the Times filed last year. But in terms of, that's kind of the news business. In terms of how we're thinking about the future of journalism inside the newsroom, again, I mean, I think it's a very trial and error process. I think what basic technology allowed us to do earlier, I think we're using kind of more, well, at least we're I would say it's more technology, not necessarily AI at this point, but the kinds of journalism we're doing have expanded enormously. And, take, for instance, visual journalism and visual investigations. And by that, I don't mean charts and graphs, right? Those have been part of, like, everyone who reads news is familiar with that, and photographs. But what we're able to do now is like use huge data sets and kind of create, using the help of technology, to create really, really meaningful, impactful pieces that might not be as impactful if told in text, right? For instance, if you're thinking, a recent example would be the victory of Donald Trump, right? And kind of thinking about the red wave that overtook so much of America. Now, those numbers and the poll numbers, all of that's there. But in terms of being able to see the visual impact, which is much more meaningful, I think, is to kind of use blue state to red state, like using that data to actually create this visual change that speaks to the broader trend of what's happening. I think so things like that, the use of technology to to produce journalism in kind of much more significant and different ways. Other examples, I think, would be what not just the Times, what everyone's trying to do is find a way to build trust with readers. And that, again, because of this polarized environment that we are in, where, with the extreme right and extremely progressive left and kind of no meeting ground in between, nefarious actors, people on X Twitter. So I think what's happening there is this ability to kind of create trust using technology, using just very small but basic things that we weren't able to do and we didn't think to do sooner. For instance, getting reporters to talk about themselves, right? Doing these little vertical videos where you're helping the reader think about why a story is written a certain way, right? So you're actually trying to connect by using more multimedia elements. And this isn't, again, I think it's something that we're really experimenting with. And I think the results have been very good because it tells you that the reporter isn't just some anonymous person just sitting somewhere with a computer and typing stuff away, right? There is a lot of effort that goes into verifying before you kind of put information out there. One old adage in journalism is that if your mother says she loves you, go check it out, right? It's just kind of this idea that every little piece of information is verified, and you need to be able to make sure that your reader trusts you with that. So we found that the video format is much more important, much more engaging, and a better way to connect with readers. So we're using all of these little elements, visual journalism, much more kind of investing a lot more. We're using video formats. We're using, of course, podcasts and newsletters. And kind of the other piece of it is the amount we're investing in audience measurement and metrics. And that has been helpful, but it's a double-edged sword, right? So the reason why it's helpful is that you actually now can see how much of a story a reader reads, right? So you've written a 1,200-word story about something, and if you're finding that the reader just spends, goes down to the top third of the story and has moved on, or has just spent 30 seconds in the story, it gives you that information and tells you that maybe you need to change the way you're doing news. For us, that's meant that, so the longer stories, the long form pieces where you're writing thousands of words, they do pretty well with readers because readers can jump in and kind of, they have time and they'll read that. And then you have the news stories where something's happened and it's like the quick hit and you kind of write and move on. But a lot of the stories that journalists, reporters like to write, and many of us do write those stories, are 1,200 words, just to take kind of like this arbitrary, it's actually 1,200 words is kind of the place where the stories are least read. And we didn't know that earlier. We just didn't think about it. We didn't know it. But now you have that kind of supporting data to tell you that these things just don't work. So let's give the reader maybe what they want, what they need. Same thing, I think we're building with other products. You've seen the level of engagement with the New York Times cooking app and games. I don't know if people play Spelling Bee and Wordle, but they have been huge successes. And so we've invested a lot of money into, again, think about it. It's like you always had games in the print paper too, right? But being able to, but in a print, like the physical print paper, no one was going to start buying your product, your newspaper, because it had games or a crossword. But now, because it's a digital form and because it's very well designed and because we have that data and information telling us that this has been really successful, you can then drive your subscription strategy using that information, right? Using that knowledge, which is made possible by this level of measurement and engagement, to actually say, okay, we can build a business around just the NYT cooking app, right? Because it's got all of these elements that readers really love, about recipes and about the experiences of reporters. And again, as I was saying, like making the people who write the recipes, the chefs and the reporters, kind of making them more real, right? Like, oh, I connect with you because you're telling me about like chopping garlic in this way, and oh, that's a problem I always have in the kitchen. So that's all in an app that we're and this is very recent, right? You're thinking about a paper that's more than 100 years old, and this is just something that's happened in the past like few years, I would say in the past 2 or 3 years, where we've really taken a technology and integrated it into our newsroom in all of these different ways that I've been talking about. And I mean, one thing I love the fact that there was someone walking outside the Times building maybe last year, and I saw this, and I think it would have been like a 22-year-old, and she walked by and she saw the Times, the building, and said New York Times. She's like, oh, that's the Wordle company, right? Like, so for her, that was what it was. But like, think of it, that's just a way in which you're grabbing a new reader, right? They're coming to you through Wordle or through NYT cooking or games or what have you, or sports or Wirecutter, which is a product review service that does really well. So there are all these new ways that you can then try to pull in a bigger range variety of readers. You can also then go international. I think, India is obviously a big focus for us, and just because there's a deep level of interest in coverage of India by Indians, which is why I'm in this job. So hopefully I'm going to do a good job of it. But I think that's one piece of it. In terms of one other thing that I wanted to talk about was also AI. Again, it's very preliminary. Like, we don't quite know where we're going to go with using AI in the newsroom. But as I was kind of referring to earlier, we have been hiring. We just hired sometime in the past year a director of operations for AI, right? And his main job is to look across the newsroom and see how we can adopt certain tools to make our journalism easier and better. And I think that's true not just of newsrooms in general. For instance, when you think about Wall Street and like the investment banking business, where for ages and ages, the way to get into investment banking has been the 2-year analyst program, right? So you go to undergrad, wherever you're going, and you want to join banking or finance. And one of the easiest ways, not easy, it's very tough to get into, but say at a Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan or any of these banks, you join the 2-year program, you get selected for it. And those 2 years are absolutely nightmarish, right? Because someone's doing, like, your bosses are telling you to do the most basic work, and you're basically doing PowerPoints, and you're putting together very elementary items. And it's part of a hazing ritual too. So you're sitting there till 4 o'clock because your boss wants you to do it. So there's a cultural element, but there's also actual work that is drudgery. And AI now has the potential to actually make the lives of those analysts easier, allowing them to focus on some of the more value-added work that they can do. And it's a similar bet inside newsrooms that if we can free up reporters from that drudge work of like, okay, I've just taken notes and it's an hour-long interview, and now I have to sit there and transcribe it because like Apple's transcription service is not good enough yet. So like, can we build our own AI? Can we work with another company to build easier and better transcription services that would make the work of reporters, make their lives easier, right? And research, again, I think is hugely important, and as a starting point, not as a replacement, right? I don't think we would ever, who knows, but unless like this is an early iteration of generative AI. But like at this point, I don't think anyone's saying that the work of a reporter can be substituted by summary written by, a computer. Essentially, I don't think that's the goal. The goal more is to see how AI can be a tool and how help make journalism better by allowing reporters to focus on what really kind of matters. So, this is where I see, one is the existential nature of the threat to journalism from technology. And the other is the value add and the importance of that same technology to make newsrooms better, to help, engage more readers, to help kind of I don't want to be too idealistic, but the project of democracy, I think, depends on a lot of newspapers having that kind of ability to function and ability to do their reporters to do their job better. And so, future-wise, I mean, these are emerging trends, and it's really too early to say anything beyond that. I think we're all in a state of flux, and I talk about what's going on inside the Times newsroom, but you can see a version of it at the Washington Post, at the Wall Street Journal. I think everyone is struggling with the same set of questions, and it always reminds me of back in the early 2010s when your business model was again upended by the presence of a new kind of technology, i.e., search and advertising coming together to basically change the way newspapers ran their businesses. And at the same time, kind of having that newer generation of technology forcing us to adapt how we developed our journalism. And I think we're at that same point now. And it's always interesting that it's like one company. Then it was Google, and now it's Microsoft. And there will be others. Obviously, Microsoft and OpenAI aren't the only companies with with this agenda essentially. But I think the bet this time around, or at least the realization right now, is that okay, we got screwed over once. We're going to be more aggressive about not getting screwed over a second time. We don't know where that goes, but we want to make sure that we get paid for our work. And so I hope that is a business decision, but I think that's really important. And we often forget that part of the journalism business because you always think very idealistically, or at least I did. That's why I got into journalism. I want to take like the big powers down. And then I got into financial journalism, which is a whole other story. But we talk a lot about all the goals and aims of journalism, but I wanted to give you all a sense of the business side of it and what's happened in the past and where we're poised to go in the future. So that's all I have to say. And, if anyone has questions, or I'd be happy to take a Q&A, I think.
So I started my career as a journalist. So I've been a cub reporter many, many years ago when my hair was not grey. And running from story after story, started off as a print journalist and then became a television journalist. And so I understand the drill behind the newsroom. And what I found really fascinating was that you chose to speak about the business of journalism, right? Because now what's happening is that journalism is being governed by the business. Initially, the editorial team would be a silo. They would be sacrosanct, like nobody could touch the editorial. But now there are a lot of other factors that come into play. So how truthful can news actually be?
I mean, that's always kind of a central question, right? I think the publishing side of the business and the business of the business, right? Then you have the editorial and the opinion, and then you have the newsroom. Those are still very much on the journalism side of it, right? What's happening today? What should we write about? What should we report on? the the publishing side of the business, right? The guys who make the actual decisions, the guys who look at the accounts and say, okay, we're not doing well this quarter. I think that definitely has become more important, has always been important, but I think in order to make sure that journalism itself survives, you really do need to focus and you do need someone to make sure that you're not spending your money inefficiently, which is what I think a lot of it happened. When I was talking about before, back in the 2000s, a lot of news organizations were just paying great money to reporters, sending them abroad. I'm not saying they didn't produce good journalism, but it was not done in a financially thoughtful way. So I thought that to me has always been interesting. Maybe like journalists aren't the best at math or accounts, so we do need.
That's why we become one.
Exactly. But I think without a business side, you're not going to have a future that's protected and secure and stable.
What do you think is the playbook of ethics for a new age journalist? Because that's hugely changed, right? Like you spoke about audience metrics, looking at metrics, you spoke about audience measurement. Then we also speak about like where is the capital coming from, right? So what we say is truth is also being seen from a lens of what truth is supposed to be or what truth feels right to you at this point in time. So what do you think is the playbook for a new age journalist?
I don't think it changes at all. I mean, your goal has always been, to the best of your ability, to have faithfully done as much as you can to verify a piece of information, right? That means you heard something. Okay, that could be real, that could be, not real, that could be false, true. You then go around calling people, doing that shoe leather work and saying, hey, do you know this to be true, right? And if you do know it to be true, how do you know it to be true, right? Just going through those motions, I don't think that changes if you're going to be ethical and honest about how you do your journalism, no matter what way you present it. I think you have to, and that is what sets people apart. What you're getting is a lot of hot takes, which is just kind of, I think, um, not quite opinion, but a little bit of data, and then with a spin on it. And those things can be sometimes could get confused with what I would say is traditional reporting, and so that does kind of muddy the picture. But I would say that ethical journalism, good journalism, has to be, because your reputation depends on it, and that doesn't change no matter what the platform.
Very interesting. You said that you've hired like a new director of AI. What are the new kind of jobs that will come up in this new age of journalism?
It's I think the hires that we've been doing in our newsroom have been so many more tech and coding and audience and people who have those skills, right? That's become a big part of who we're hiring. And I think that shows you that we do consider that to be kind of a foundational piece of our journalism, of setting up our journalism for the future. And so I think that, again, it's a bit of a flux. We just hired Zach, who is both a journalist but also has been in tech for a long time, and so someone who understands how to put the two together. But he has a year to really figure it out before he starts making changes, and so it's very much up in the air. But I will say that we're preparing that foundation for a different age.
Very interesting. I'll open the questions for audience. Oh wow, lots of hands shining up. Can we have the mic, please? Here, in the front.
Thank you. Extremely insightful discussion. I think my question is somewhere around ethics, but comes to the intersection of technology and politics in news. So, with the coming in of technology in news, there is this sense of dehumanization, but there's also a heightening of politicization of news. How does a reporter or a journalist deal with that?
Sorry, so by technology, you mean just the use of technology?
The use of
And-
technology, especially with things like AI.
Yeah, I mean, I think the easiest way, not it's the toughest way, but it's the most straightforward way, is to really, really just go in and verify and do not take anything at face value, especially with AI becoming so much more sophisticated, right? Something you see is probably might not be something, that has happened. So always like make sure that if there's a photo or a video of a riot, say, who is it from? How do you verify? You go to a credible news outlet and you say, this is something that you've that says is from you. Is it from you? And if it means being second to the story, that's okay. Do not risk. I say, like, it's not worth the risk of being first with something if you're going to be wrong. Like, I'd rather you be last because that's a matter of credibility. And I think we are doing more workshops and training internally to help journalists think through, right? Because we have to rewire our brains as well. You're kind of used to like accepting that something you see is, especially on video, it's something you see is must be legit, but you have to like then undergo all these tests to like show like what is true and what is not. And so we're definitely doing some of those workshops in our newsroom.
Good evening, ma'am. So, I'm a media student myself at the moment, and our curriculum at the moment is very heavily driven by teaching us AI and how to use AI when it comes to certain journalistic practices like transcription and fact checking. Now, my concern is now, as you said, AI is, taking predominant information from news media outlets to, factor their thing first. How do you think it's going to affect journalistic principles like transparency and accountability in the next 15 to 20 years? Now, even for instance, if you search on Google about a particular question you have or a particular issue, it's always Google's experimental AI telling us the answer first before the verified source comes in. So, in a matter of 20 years, when we are going to be struggling to prove what is right and wrong, how do you think we as journalists can compete with AI at that point of time?
It's a bigger project, and I think it's a social project as well, because there's Gen Z, but you have future generations growing up with information delivered to them in a certain way, right? They might not be going to a news organization or a newspaper like our parents or grandparents did for their source of news. So I think there has to be training much more for people to understand the role of journalism, but also understand where credible news comes from. And that, and again, it's two-sided, because I do expect that AI will get better. You're not going to have, hopefully, the hallucinations and things that are causing, even more havoc right now. In the information that AI gives us when we type in a query, right? So I think it'll get better as we engage more and learn more about each other, human journalists and information spitting robots. So I think it's a two-way thing. But again, trust. And yes, how do you build trust and how do you sustain it? I think brand is very important. And there's a chance that if it's the Hindu, you might trust it to deliver a piece of news in a measured and balanced way versus, say, taking a different example for a different country, say the New York Post. It might be written in a more salacious way, but you know what the Post stands for, and you know what the Hindu stands for, or the New York Times stands for. So you engage with that information in a different way. So I think trust building becomes even more important. And then teaching kids, teaching people, again, to understand how information is presented to them, and urging them and educating them to be able to make those distinctions. I think that's why I say it's a social project as well, that, because we're taking a longer view, I think that becomes really important.
Thank you so much.
Another way to actually look at it is, instead of looking at AI as competition or threat to a human journalist, how can AI be a collaborator? What is something that the human hand can do, but you should focus on what the hand can do, but do what only you can do in terms of your mind. So the thought, the direction, the structure, the content, the ethics, the transparency comes from you. And like she was mentioning, all the transcription and the editing and the proofreading is something that anyone, those entry level things that all of us do as journalists, can be outsourced to AI. So if you were to think of AI as your collaborator and not your competitor, maybe the question that you'll be grappling with is very different. I hope that answers.
Very true.
Hi. So I'm a researcher, and my research is primarily based on these LLMs. And we are facing this issue, like some of the issues that you mentioned. And there were two parts to my question. The first is LLMs these days have a retrieval mechanism to it. So, in simple words, what they can do is just make an internet search, and it can give you real-time information based on whatever data or source it's using, and it also cites that source in its answer. So what do you think about that? And the second part to my question was about a few copyright issues, and the way we are trying to solve it is by using synthetic data. And what we are seeing is, the bigger the model is, the more data it is trained on, the better the model is, mostly. So we are trying to not use the real data, but make the LLM itself generate some synthetic data and then train the model on it. So do you think that will, in a way, like remove the copyright issues from the LLMs? What do you think about these two things?
The first part of your question, when something is being synthesized in real time, right? It still is, from the newspaper's point of view, from my organization's point of view, it's still an issue because we too are covering something in real time, right? We now have our website. When you go to the website, and if there's breaking news and something that's evolving in real time, we have live, right? We have a way where our reporters are putting out information as quickly as we can. So if you, as a reader, want to go somewhere to have live updates, that's where you would go, and you would have to pay and subscribe to do that. Now, if an AI, is taking that information and producing it simultaneously, that is an issue, right? Because that allegedly is an issue. Now, there might be other arguments that I am not thinking of, but that becomes an issue for a newspaper, because you're essentially not out there. You're not out there in the field. You're just processing someone else's information, and you're doing it that as quickly as possible, which is much faster. And I don't see that being able to synthesize that data from multiple sources makes it any more authentic or any more real. The issue there is that maybe there's a legal argument to be made about fair use, which is, again, specifically a US law, that you can take enough bits of information from 10 different media organizations and provide kind of, a meta narrative of that information. And so it doesn't quite hit the fair use mark, but it doesn't quite like infringe on copyright, because it's in the interest of the greater good, i.e. the people should know. But I do feel like that's, to me, an almost a dishonest way to do news, especially if you're a human and you're out there in the field and trying to bring an information and seeing and kind of, authoring and bringing the truth to someone based on what you've seen and heard and your entire expertise built on covering something, versus someone just taking that information and producing it. So I think there are ethical questions around that to be had. And I don't know that, synthesizing data from multiple news outlets gets you out of the legal problem maybe, but doesn't really address the underlying bigger problems with that model.
There's a question there.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for all the information. I want to pick up on your 1200 story, not 1200 word story, not engaging. I mean, I think I'm reflecting on myself as a New York Times reader for many years. Engagement has grown. I spend more time on it. But if I were to think of what parts I spend more time on, it is the game section, it is the sports section, it is the kind of lifestyle part of it. So I'm just wondering whether, in your effort to keep your pace, this whole insidious creep of people now not focusing on the news part as much and more on the entertainment part of it, is that a problem, and how do you balance that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question because it's something I personally grapple with when I think about my own industry, right? Because on the one hand, it's great, give the people what they want, right? You're interested in sports, you're interested in, health, that's what you feed to people. That's what the algorithms are trained to do. And that's why, for instance, we've hired 50 people in what we call our well desk because people really want to know about health related issues. And so that's where your efforts are going. At the same time, reading the news, it's a little bit like, eating your peas or the equivalent metaphor in the sense that to be truly well informed, right, to be to have knowledge of everything that's going on, or as much as you should, and none of us can, means reading news that might not appeal to you naturally, that you might not be clicking on, and that's up to a news organization to kind of provide that information in a way where you're kind of learning about all of it. And I always say, like, think about the print product, right? When you think about a newspaper and the serendipity of, like, oh, I'm reading this cricket story, but oh, look, there's this other story about pandas and why they take so long to breed, right? I'd never thought of pandas, or that would ever be exciting or interesting to me, but now I've read it just because of the layout, right? So that aspect of serendipity does get lost. So how are you keeping a citizen fully informed about everything they know to go about and lead meaningful lives? That's tough, and I don't think we have an answer to that. We're trying to balance. We're trying to say that no matter what, some stories, even if just one person read it, we needed to have that story out there because that story is important, whether or not it gets read, it gets like traffic hits. But more broadly, you're also trying to kind of make sure that you're engaging and sustaining the reader. And you hope that there's enough of a balance all around. But yeah, it's something that I always think about, and I don't, and I know we all do, but I think we're just trying to make sure that we're true to our profession, by which I mean just making sure that we're providing and reporting the news when we think it's necessary for everyone to know.
That actually brings us to a very interesting place. A journalist needs to be on the move all the time, right? And there's so much information coming to you. And whenever there's a disaster in the world, there's a war, there's a crisis, there's a famine, we need to be clued in all the time. How do journalists keep their mental health in check?
Poorly. I think that's been a problem. I think no matter, and I've worked in many different newsrooms over the decades, and the stress is incredible. And in a way, it's much more challenging for a reporter on the ground now because in the past you talk about being a foreign correspondent. Firstly, we don't say foreign anymore, we say international, which kind of reflects how the Times itself is trying to be seen, that it's not like US and foreign, it's like we're international. So I think like back in the day, you were writing as a foreign correspondent, you were sending a dispatch. You were saying, okay, I'm going to write this story. I'm going to write it beautifully. I'm going to have someone on the ground helping me because I don't have the language skills, not me, but whoever the foreign correspondent is. And then I'm going to write this beautiful story to send back to the mothership, which they're going to run. But now, because we're doing so much on our platforms, the demands on foreign for anyone on the ground are crazy, because someone's wanting to do a podcast, someone wants you to write like a newsletter item. Sometimes we're going live because there's a war, and so you're expected to feed into it. And then we'll get requests from other news organizations to offer our expertise, all happening at the same time. So what we do is, there are times when it's just unavoidable. People are working. Like if Donald Trump is getting reelected, people are going to work 24/7. There's just no way around it. But we do try to do, pass the baton kind of thing. And you do give reporters what we call breather weeks, which I think is very important, so that you can just go. This is in addition to vacation. Like these are like, you have to give people that time to just do nothing, because they're working so much more. The demands are so much more on reporters now than just writing a story.
Very interesting. Because I remember when in my earlier journalism days, there's an earthquake, and the first people the families call are news channels, right? Can you just put my family's name on the ticker and say my brother's gone missing and we can't find someone anymore? When any kind of calamity, we become like the mass media for people. There is a responsibility, but there's also a responsibility towards the self, and it's always very difficult to understand where the boundaries are and where it stops. Do you feel there are interesting business models in journalism that you see today that can define the future?
Yeah, newsletters and Substack. I mean, in a way, like this to me has been kind of revelatory when you think about history in America. When you read about Tocqueville and his observations about America in the 18th century, what he saw this very exciting kind of social environment where people were writing newsletters, right? If you had two people reading your, what you had to write and paying you a penny for it, that was great. So everyone with a voice and something to say could write something and have, print it or handwrite multiple copies and circulate it. And so I think there's a version of that going on right now, which is that people, again, even if like your trust perhaps in an organization has broken down, you might be a fan of X because you really trust what they're saying, and they can charge you for it. They can monetize that. They can then say that, okay, I have enough people, enough followers, and they're willing to pay me, right? They're willing to pay me. Sorry. They're willing to pay me for my reporting, for what I want to say, and I'm going to do that. And that's become a very popular business model. Now, it cannot be widespread because there's only a certain number of people who have the cachet and the power to do that. So I think Substacks, newsletters, those things have disrupted that traditional big newsroom. So you have a lot of people and they can be nimble too. And some of them use social media, but increasingly you want to be paid for it. So I think newsletters have been a big part of it, and also smaller independent news outfits, maybe with 5, 6, 7 people that again are created by someone who has the trust of an audience and can therefore find enough people who will pay for that.
Amazing. I think there's still a little bit of hope when it comes to journalism.
You have to be an optimist, yeah.
Thanks so much, Anupreeta.
Is there time for a question?
Last question, please.
Okay.
We have the next speaker ready.
I was just curious in the context of these two big trends that we've seen in the US election, something like a Joe Rogan podcast, which is kind of new age journalism, which actually tilted the election in Trump's favor. And then we also saw something like Jeff Bezos, clamp down on the editorial for Washington Post when the editorial team wanted to endorse Kamala Harris. And it's very interesting because you're at that point of ethical journalism, but these more personality-driven moves are journalism that has mass impact for social change, if you may. So I'm very curious to know your take about ethical journalism? Is it going to be now more for the intellectuals and posterity in some way? Or how do you intend to make ethical journalism in a hot take-ish kind of way where it can actually have social impact in the now? Thanks.
Yeah, that, I mean, Joe Rogan, I don't know if I'd call him a journalist in the traditional sense of someone who verifies information and tries to provide the most balanced view, but that is a kind of media that is increasingly popular. Again, like a version of the newsletter, someone with a podcast and with a big audience. Now, on the Bezos side of things, I think that is probably a practical decision by a businessman who, this is my personal opinion, of course, by a businessman who didn't want to upset an incoming, president. And I think you did that. And this is a different conversation too about billionaires and their ownership of newsrooms and what they can allow and what they don't allow based on their business interests and what that means for ethical journalism. But we are out of time, I know, and so I'm happy to take that question and give you more of my insights if you'd ever like. So
Amazing. Thank you so much, Anupreeta, for your time.
Thank you so much.